Every incident your organization experiences contains valuable lessons. Hidden within each breach, each near miss, each system failure, these are filled with insights that could prevent the next incident or the next 10 incidents. But most organizations never extract those lessons, and it's not because they don't try, but it's because their approach to incident review actually prevents honest disclosure and genuine learning. So this lesson is for examining why traditional incident reviews often fail and how you can implement blameless post-mortem techniques that transform incidents from organizational embarrassments into opportunities for meaningful improvement. So let's discuss a scenario that illustrates the failure of blame-focused reviews. A phishing email gets through your defenses, an employee clicks the link, enters their credentials, and attackers gain access to your network. In a traditional review, what happens? Someone asked who clicked that link. The focus immediately shifts to finding the person responsible, the person to blame. Now think about what happens next. The employee who clicked knows they're about to face consequences, maybe a formal reprimand, mandatory training, or worse. What's their incentive in that moment? It's definitely not to provide a detailed, honest account of exactly what happened. Their incentive is to minimize their role, justify their actions, whatever it takes to protect themselves. Remember, our jobs are how we pay our mortgage or our rent. Our jobs are how we feed our kids. So it's not just the person directly involved, though. Everyone in that review meeting is watching. Now, they're learning that when something goes wrong, someone gets punished. Whose head is going on the chopping block? So the next time they notice a security issue, the next time they make a mistake, what do you think they're going to do? There's a high probability and a historical evidence that at that point they're going to stay quiet. They'll hope nobody notices and they'll cover it up if they can. This is the fundamental problem with blame-focused reviews. They optimize for self-protection, not organizational learning. The consequences compound over time. Root causes remain hidden because people don't feel safe revealing them. The same mistakes repeat because you're addressing symptoms rather than underlying issues. Your security culture becomes one of fear and concealment rather than openness and continuous improvement. Research consistently shows that organizations with punitive incident response cultures experience longer detection time, less thorough incident documentation, and more repeat incidents. When people are afraid to report problems, you don't have fewer problems, you just have less visibility into the problems. So then we say, what's the alternative? Well, it's an approach that originated in high reliability organizations like aviation, healthcare, and nuclear power. And it's now been adopted widely in technology and increasingly in cybersecurity, called the blameless post-mortem. Blameless does not mean no one is ever held accountable for anything. It does not mean negligence or malicious behavior gets a free pass. And it does not mean we pretend human actions don't contribute to incidents. What blameless does mean is that we assume people generally try to do the right thing with the information and tools available to them. It means we focus our analyses on systems and processes rather than individual fault. And it means we ask, what allowed this to happen, rather than who should we punish? The core philosophy is that if a well-intentioned person following reasonable procedures can make a mistake that leads to a security incident, then the problem isn't the person, it's the system that allowed that mistake to have those consequences. If we think back to our phishing example, instead of asking who clicked the link, a blameless approach asks different questions. Why did that email reach the employee in the first place? What made it convincing enough to fool someone? What training had the employee received? Were there technical controls that could have prevented credential theft even after the click? Once credentials were compromised, what allowed the attackers to move laterally? So if you can see that shift there, we're shifting from individual blame to systemic vulnerability because anybody can accidentally click a link. Each question points toward potential improvements that would protect against future incidents, regardless of who might click the next phishing email. So how do you actually conduct a blameless post-mortem? Because structure does matter. Without it, reviews can easily drift back into blame seeking or devolve into unproductive discussions. There is timing and participation. Timing is important because you want to conduct your review soon enough that details are fresh, but be cautionary of the immediate response when emotions are running high. There are humans involved. For most incidents, somewhere between 24 and 72 hours after resolution works well. For major incidents, you might need a preliminary review followed by a more comprehensive one. For participation, include everyone who was involved in the incident and the response, not just technical staff, but also anyone who made decisions, communicated with stakeholders, or was affected. You want multiple perspectives. Obviously, you're not trying to bring the whole organization into it if everyone was affected, all hands meeting, but at the same time be thoughtful about hierarchy. Now, in some cases, if senior leaders are present, others may be reluctant to speak candidly. Consider having a neutral facilitator who can manage dynamics and ensure all voices are heard. And you might need separate meetings depending on what the scenario is. A well-structured, blameless post-mortem typically follows this flow. Start with establishing a shared timeline. What happened and in what order? You're not into interpretation yet, you're just on facts. At 2:15 p.m., the alert fired. At 2:22 p.m., the person was notified. At 2:45 p.m., the action was taken. Build a complete factual picture before you try to analyze it. Next, examine each decision point, not to judge whether decisions were right or wrong, but to understand what information was available at the time and what reasoning led to each choice. Because this is crucial, decisions that look obviously wrong in hindsight often made perfect sense, given what people knew in the moment. And the job here is to understand that moment, not to apply hindsight. And then identify contributing factors. What conditions, processes, tools, or circumstances contributed to the incident occurring or to response delays? Look for systemic factors, things that would exist regardless of which specific individuals were involved. And then finally, develop improvement actions based on the analyses. What specific changes would reduce the likelihood or impact of similar incidents? The questions you ask during a post-mortem determine what you'll learn. Blame-oriented questions shut down disclosure, but learning-oriented questions open it up. Instead of asking why, ask how and what. Why did you click that link? Feels accusatory, puts the person on defense, and harms your ability to get the best insight. But what made that email look legitimate to you invites explanation and surfaces useful information about social engineering techniques that work. Why didn't you escalate sooner? That implies failure. If you instead say, what information would have helped you recognize this needed escalation? This can reveal gaps in training or procedures. It's not about coddling people. It's about getting the information, and you can't get it as well or as thoroughly or in a way that's going to help you fix the situation if you use those why accusatory feeling statements or questions. Now, every organization has formal procedures and actual practices. Sometimes they match, often they don't. A key post-mortem question is, were there workarounds, shortcuts, or informal practices involved? Not for the sake of punishing, but to understand. If people are routinely bypassing a security control that tells you something important, maybe the control creates too much friction. Maybe people don't understand its purpose or don't know how to use it. Maybe there's a better way to achieve the same security goal, or maybe you need more awareness in your organization in association with those controls. And don't focus exclusively on failures. What worked well in detection and response? Ask about what went right. What prevented this from being worse? Understanding success is just as valuable as understanding failure because you want to reinforce and replicate what works. For every human error identified, ask what made that error possible? What could have prevented it? And for every delayed response, ask what processes or tools could have accelerated the response. Keep pushing past individual actions to the systems that shaped the actions. You've heard of the 5 whys technique, perhaps, and it's a classic technique involving asking why repeatedly to drill down to root causes. But we just talked about don't use why, because in a blameless context, you need to frame it differently. What led to this rather than why did you do this? Root cause analysis with the 5 whys can become very flawed when they're not phrased in a less aggressive and a more meaningful way. So, for example, the attacker exfiltrated data. What led to that? They had access to sensitive files. What led to that? Their compromised account had broad permissions. What led to that? Permissions weren't reviewed when the employee changed roles. What led to that? There's no automated process for permission review during role changes. That could be a response. Now you've moved from someone stole data to we need automated permission reviews during role transitions, and that's actionable systemic improvement. A post-mortem is only going to be valuable if it leads to actual improvement. Otherwise, you're just wasting your time. And documentation plays a critical role here. It can be the bridge between analyses and action. Your post-mortem document should include a factual timeline of the incident, a description of the business impact, analyses of contributing factors, and systemic issues that enabled the incident or complicated response. It should also include what went well in detection and response, and specific improvement actions with owners and timelines, and how you'll verify that improvements are effective. Language matters in the documentation, right? For action, not blame. Compare these 2 statements. The incident occurred because John failed to follow the password policy. Alternatively, it could say, the incident occurred because compromised credentials provided network access. Contributing factors included password policy that permitted weak credentials, lack of multi-factor authentication on the affected system, and no automated detection of credential stuffing attacks. The first statement assigns blame and suggests one fix. Make John follow policy. And that assumes that nobody else in the organization is going to make any mistakes and it's just John. Bad John. Big bad John. Now the second identifies systemic issues instead, and it points toward multiple potential improvements, so it actually has meaning. The organization using that second option is more likely to improve their security posture. It's also important to note the vague action items don't get done. Improved security training is not an action item. By March 15th, implement quarterly phishing simulations for all employees with automated remedial training for those who fail, measured by click-through rates, is an action item. Every improvement has to have an owner, a deadline, and a way to verify completion and effectiveness. And without these, your post-mortem document becomes a list of good intentions that never materialize, just data taking up space on the system. Money you paid for work that meant nothing. The follow-through is where a lot of organizations fail. They might conduct thoughtful post-mortems. They might identify meaningful improvements, and then nothing happens. The document gets filed, people return to their regular work, the next incident occurs, and the same contributing factors are present. Following through requires intentional effort. Treat post-mortem action items like any other project commitment. Add them to your tracking system, review progress in regular meetings, and don't let them disappear into a forgotten document. And make sure action owners actually have the authority and resources to implement their assigned improvements. Assigning an action to someone who can't actually make it happen is setting everyone up for failure. People get very frustrated. And schedule a follow-up meeting, perhaps 30 or 60 days after the postmortem, specifically to review progress on improvements. This can create accountability without blame. If improvements haven't been completed, the question isn't why didn't you do this, but instead, what obstacles are preventing progress and how can we address them? And then close the loop. When improvements are implemented, document that completion. When you can demonstrate that a later incident was prevented or contained because of a previous postmortem improvement, share that story, because that's going to reinforce the value of the blameless approach and encourage continued engagement. We're looking for solutions here, and to be able to share these solutions and to be able to evolve our solutions to continuously be more effective. So then what about the genuine negligence? We've talked about this in a much earlier lesson. What about repeated mistakes? What about the person who didn't truly follow clear procedures that they definitely understood? Blameless does not mean no accountability ever. It means accountability is separate from the learning process. So the useful framework here is evaluate behavior against what a reasonable person with similar training and information would have done in the same situation. If the behavior falls within normal human variation, the kind of mistake anyone might make, then the focus should be entirely on systemic improvement. The individual made an error, but the system should have been robust enough to prevent that error from having serious consequences. If the behavior involves clear negligence, deliberate policy violation, or malicious intent, then accountability processes may be appropriate. But even then, keep accountability separate from the postmortem. These are two separate things. The learning review must be focused on systemic factors. Personnel issues have to be handled through appropriate HR and management channels, not in front of the postmortem team. A useful distinction: did the person follow normal practices that turned out to be inadequate, or did they deviate from practices they knew to be important? The former points to systemic issues, the latter may warrant individual accountability. The key principle is that people should never fear punishment for honest participation in post-mortem reviews. Even under the situations where individual accountability is required, the person should understand that their honest disclosure in the review won't be used against them. This can be challenging to maintain, which is why some organizations have formal policies protecting post-mortem testimony from use in disciplinary proceedings. Now, the almost never scenario, if the employee in the post-mortem says, "I knew it was wrong, I knew it would cause problems, I did it because I wanted to cause problems," and they're not joking, well, that's an edge case. So blameless postmortems are not just a technique, they're an expression of organizational culture, and implementing them effectively requires broader cultural elements. There's leadership modeling, psychological safety, celebrating learning, not just preventing incidents, and normalizing failure as learning opportunity. We've reviewed all of these in various parts of the course. So when you implement these approaches to achieve a true learning culture, incidents can become opportunities. And these are opportunities to strengthen your defenses, improve your processes, and build an organization that gets better every time something goes wrong. And that's the essence of learning from incidents without blame, and one of the most valuable cultural shifts any security program can make. In the next lesson, we will talk about emerging threats on the horizon. We'll examine 5 categories of emerging threats and review how to think strategically about these developments rather than reactively chasing every scary headline.